The silence in the HR office was deafening. My daughter Madison sat across from her supervisor, tears streaming down her face as the termination papers were slid across the polished mahogany desk. 3 years of lies, manipulation, and theft had finally caught up with her. But what she didn't know was that I had been the one to provide the evidence that brought her down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As I watched from the parking garage through binoculars, seeing her world crumble through those floor-to-ceiling windows, I felt something I never thought I'd feel about my own child. A mixture of relief and devastating sadness. The daughter I had raised, the girl I'd sacrificed everything for, had become someone I barely recognized. And in just a few hours, she would storm into my house and scream those words that would echo in my mind forever. "You ruined my life." But she had no idea that she had ruined mine first. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and at 54 years old, I never imagined I'd be sitting in my car watching my own daughter lose the job that had cost me my marriage, my savings, and nearly my sanity to help her get. The corporate towers of downtown Chicago stretched endlessly into the gray October sky, and somewhere in that maze of glass and steel, Madison was about to face the consequences of choices that had been years in the making. Madison had always been my pride and joy. Even after her mother, Caroline, left us when Madison turned 16, I held on to the belief that I could be enough for both of us. Caroline had grown tired of what she called my obsession with Madison's success, claiming I was turning our daughter into a spoiled princess who believed the world owed her everything. I dismissed Caroline's concerns as jealousy, convinced that a mother who would abandon her child during the most crucial years of her development had no right to judge my parenting. Looking back now, I can see how wrong I was about so many things. Madison graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern University with a degree in marketing, thanks to the hefty tuition payments I made by working 70-hour weeks at my construction company. While other kids worked part-time jobs to help with expenses, I insisted Madison focus solely on her studies. I wanted her to have every advantage, every opportunity that I never had growing up in the rough neighborhoods of South Chicago. After graduation, Madison struggled to find work, despite her impressive credentials. The job market was competitive, and entry-level positions in marketing seemed to require experience that new graduates simply didn't have. Month after month, I watched her confidence erode with each rejection letter. She would sit in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by participation trophies and academic awards, scrolling through job postings with increasing desperation. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I had been working on a major renovation project for Hartwell & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious marketing firms. The owner, Richard Hartwell, and I had developed a good working relationship over the months I spent upgrading their office space. Richard was impressed with my attention to detail and my ability to complete the project ahead of schedule and under budget. During one of our final meetings, I mentioned Madison's situation. I showed her resume, spoke proudly of her academic achievements, and emphasized her dedication and work ethic. What I didn't tell him was that I was prepared to do whatever it took to get my daughter a position at his firm. Richard seemed genuinely interested and agreed to meet with Madison for an informal interview. I was ecstatic. Finally, my connections and hard work could open doors for my daughter that merit alone hadn't been able to unlock. The interview went well, and within a week, Madison received an offer for an entry-level marketing coordinator position. The starting salary was decent, the benefits were excellent, and most importantly, it was a foot in the door at a company known for promoting from within. Madison was thrilled, and I felt like I had finally done something right as a father. What Madison didn't know was the real cost of that job. Richard had made it clear during our private conversation that hiring Madison was a favor to me, not just based on her qualifications. In exchange for giving my daughter a chance, I agreed to reduce my fee for the renovation project by 30%. That reduction cost me nearly $40,000 in profit, money I had been planning to take a vacation, and maybe even start dating again. But seeing the joy on Madison's face when she got that offer made every sacrifice worth it. Or so I thought. Madison threw herself into her new role with enthusiasm. She worked late nights, volunteered for extra projects, and seemed genuinely passionate about building her career. For the first 6 months, everything appeared to be going perfectly. She received positive feedback from her supervisors, made friends with her colleagues, and began talking about long-term goals within the company. I was proud of how well she was adapting to professional life, and I began to relax for the first time in years. My daughter was finally independent and successful. The financial sacrifice I had made seemed like a small price to pay for her happiness and security. But then, things started to change. Madison began coming home later and later, claiming she was working on important projects that required her undivided attention. Her wardrobe suddenly upgraded from department store pieces to designer labels that I knew were far beyond her salary range. When I asked about her new clothes, she explained that image was important in her industry and that she had been saving up for professional attire. I wanted to believe her explanations, but something felt off. Madison had never been particularly interested in fashion before, and the transformation seemed sudden and dramatic. She carried herself differently, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The humble, grateful daughter who had been so appreciative of the job opportunity began to be replaced by someone who seemed to feel entitled to success. Our conversations became increasingly superficial. Where we once talked about her daily experiences at work, she now offered only vague responses about meetings and deadlines. When I tried to ask specific questions about her projects or colleagues, she would change the subject or claim I wouldn't understand the complexities of her industry. The distance between us grew wider with each passing week. Madison began spending most evenings out with her new work friends, leaving me alone in the house that we had shared for so many years. I told myself this was natural, that she was simply building a social life appropriate for a young professional. But deep down, I missed the close relationship we had always shared. About 8 months into her employment, I received an unexpected call from Richard Hartwell. He wanted to discuss some additional work on a new office space they were considering. During our meeting, he casually mentioned that Madison was doing well, but seemed to be struggling with some of the more complex aspects of her role. This confused me because Madison had been telling me that she was excelling and had even hinted at a possible promotion. When I probed gently for more details, Richard explained that while Madison was certainly enthusiastic and well-liked by her colleagues, her actual performance had been inconsistent. Some of her campaigns had failed to meet objectives, and there had been questions about her attention to detail. I left that meeting feeling unsettled. Why would Madison be giving me a different version of her professional performance? Was she trying to protect my feelings, or was there something more concerning happening? That night, I tried to have an honest conversation with Madison about her work. I approached the topic carefully, not wanting to sound accusatory or overbearing. I simply asked how things were going and whether there were any challenges she wanted to discuss. Madison's response was immediate and defensive. She accused me of checking up on her and violating her privacy. She insisted that everything was going perfectly and that any suggestion otherwise was completely unfounded. Her reaction was so intense and emotional that I backed down, apologizing for making her feel uncomfortable. But the seed of doubt had been planted. I began paying closer attention to the small details of Madison's life that I had been overlooking. Her expensive clothes weren't just professional attire. They were luxury brands that would cost more than her entire monthly salary. Her new handbags, shoes, and jewelry suggested a lifestyle that was completely incompatible with her income. When I casually asked about her finances, wondering if she needed any help managing her budget as a new professional, Madison became evasive. She claimed she was doing fine and had been lucky with some investments and side projects. But when I asked for details about these investments, she couldn't provide any specifics. The changes in Madison weren't just financial. Her entire personality seemed to be shifting. The compassionate, thoughtful daughter I had raised was being replaced by someone who appeared increasingly self-centered and materialistic. She spoke dismissively about people she considered beneath her professional status and seemed to have developed a sense of superiority that was completely foreign to the values I had tried to instill in her. Our relationship, once the most important thing in both our lives, was deteriorating rapidly. Madison began treating me more like an inconvenient roommate than a father. She rarely asked about my work or my life, and when I tried to share my own experiences or concerns, she seemed impatient and disinterested. I started to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake in pushing so hard to get her that job. Had I created a monster by removing the natural struggles that might have taught her important life lessons? Had my desire to give her every advantage actually disadvantaged her in ways I never anticipated? The house that had once been filled with laughter and meaningful conversations became increasingly quiet and tense. Madison would come home late, retreat to her room, and emerge only from meals that were eaten in uncomfortable silence. I found myself walking on eggshells, afraid to say anything that might trigger another defensive outburst. About a year into her employment, I noticed that Madison had stopped talking about work entirely. In the early months, despite her eventual defensiveness, she at least shared general information about her projects and colleagues. Now, she seemed to actively avoid any mention of her professional life. When I asked if everything was okay at the office, she would give me curt responses about being busy or stressed. If I pressed for more information, she would become irritated and accuse me of being nosy. It was as if her job had become a forbidden topic in our own home. I began to suspect that Madison was struggling professionally more than she was willing to admit. Perhaps the pressure of living up to the opportunity I had helped create was overwhelming her. Maybe she was afraid to disappoint me after all the sacrifices I had made to get her the position. I decided to reach out to Richard again, ostensibly to discuss some maintenance work on their offices, but really to get a better sense of how Madison was doing. Richard was polite, but seemed hesitant to discuss specifics about Madison's performance. He mentioned that there had been some concerns, but that HR was handling any issues that might arise. This vague response made me even more worried. What kind of concerns required HR involvement? Was Madison's job in jeopardy? And if so, why wasn't she being honest with me about the situation? That night, I tried once again to have an open conversation with Madison. I explained that I was concerned about her happiness and well-being, not her professional performance. I told her that I loved her regardless of how her career was progressing and that she could talk to me about anything. Madison's response was explosive. She accused me of undermining her credibility at work by talking to Richard about her. She claimed that my interference was damaging her professional reputation and making it harder for her to succeed. She demanded that I stay out of her business and stop treating her like a child. The intensity of her anger was shocking. This wasn't the rational discussion I had hoped for. It was an emotional assault that left me feeling confused and hurt. Madison stormed out of the house that night and didn't return until the following evening, offering no explanation for where she had been. Our relationship reached a new low. Madison became increasingly hostile and secretive, treating me as if I were the enemy, rather than someone who cared about her welfare. She began staying away from home for days at a time, claiming she was staying with friends, but never providing specific details about where or with whom. I felt like I was losing my daughter to someone I didn't recognize. The loving, respectful relationship we had built over so many years was crumbling before my eyes, and I couldn't understand why. All I had ever wanted was to help her succeed and be happy. How had my efforts to support her turned into the source of such conflict between us? The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in late September. Madison had been particularly distant for several weeks, barely acknowledging my presence when she was home.
I had noticed that she seemed nervous and agitated, constantly checking her phone and jumping at unexpected sounds. I was working in my home office when I heard Madison come through the front door. Instead of going directly to her room, as she usually did, she hesitated in the hallway. I could hear her pacing back and forth, as if she was trying to decide whether to approach me. After several minutes, she knocked softly on my office door. When I invited her in, I was struck by how different she looked. The confident, put-together professional persona she had been cultivating was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she appeared young and frightened, more like the uncertain daughter who struggled to find work after graduation. Madison sat down across from my desk and took a deep breath. For a moment, I thought she was finally ready to have the honest conversation we had both been avoiding. I was prepared to listen without judgment and offer whatever support she needed. But instead of opening up about her struggles, Madison delivered news that would shatter any remaining illusions I had about our situation. She told me that she was moving out. She had found an apartment closer to work and felt it was time for her to be completely independent. She would be leaving within the week. I was stunned. While our relationship had been strained, I hadn't expected Madison to simply walk away from the home we had shared for so many years.
I asked if we could work through whatever issues were causing problems between us, but she insisted that separation was the only solution. What hurt most was her suggestion that I had been holding her back. She claimed that living at home made her feel like she couldn't fully develop her professional identity. She needed space to grow and become the person she was meant to be, without the constant pressure of my expectations and concern. I tried to explain that my involvement in her life came from love, not a desire to control her. I had only wanted to help her succeed and be happy. But Madison seemed to interpret every expression of care as criticism or interference. As she prepared to leave that night, Madison turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. There was something cold and calculating in her eyes that made me feel like I was looking at a stranger. "You need to understand something, Dad," she said, her voice steady and deliberate. "I don't need you anymore. I can take care of myself, and I don't want you involved in my life. Stop calling Richard, stop asking about my work, and stop pretending like you have any right to know what I'm doing." The finality in her tone was devastating. This wasn't the emotional outburst of a stressed young adult. It was a deliberate rejection of our entire relationship. Madison was cutting me out of my life as if our years together meant nothing. Within a week, she was gone. The house felt hollow and empty without her presence. Her room sat exactly as she had left it, with only her childhood belongings remaining. Everything that represented her adult life, her professional success, and her independence had disappeared with her. I found myself questioning everything I had done as a father. Had I been too involved in her life? Had my desire to help her succeed actually damaged her ability to develop genuine confidence and skills? Was Caroline right when she warned me that I was spoiling Madison and setting her up for failure? The loneliness was overwhelming. For years, my entire life had revolved around Madison's needs and goals. Without her presence, I didn't know how to structure my days or find meaning in my routine. Work became my only distraction from the constant worry about what had gone wrong between us. I respected Madison's wishes and stopped contacting Richard about her performance. I didn't try to reach out to her directly, hoping that time and space would eventually allow us to rebuild our relationship. But weeks turned into months, and the silence between us became deafening. Occasionally, I would drive past her new apartment building, hoping to catch a glimpse of her or verify that she was okay. I never tried to approach her or interfere with her life, but I needed some reassurance that she was safe and well. The few times I saw her, she looked good, well-dressed, confident, and seemingly thriving in her independence. But something still felt wrong. Call it parental intuition or just my inability to let go of my concerns, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Madison was hiding something significant. Her sudden transformation from struggling professional to confident success story seemed too dramatic and too quick to be entirely legitimate. I began to notice patterns that didn't make sense. Madison's new apartment was in one of the most expensive areas of the city, far beyond what her salary should have been able to support.
When I researched rental prices in her building, I discovered that even a studio apartment would cost more than half her monthly income, leaving no room for the luxury lifestyle she appeared to be maintaining. My construction background had taught me to pay attention to details and trust my instincts when something didn't add up. Everything about Madison's situation suggested a level of financial success that was incompatible with her actual job position and experience level. Either she had found an additional source of income, or there was something fundamentally dishonest about how she was funding her lifestyle. The realization that my daughter might be involved in something unethical or illegal was terrifying. All my efforts to give her opportunities and advantages seemed to have backfired in the worst possible way. Instead of creating a successful, independent adult, I might have contributed to the development of someone who felt entitled to things she hadn't earned. As winter approached, I made the decision that would ultimately lead to the most painful day of my life. I had to know the truth about what Madison was doing and how she was really surviving financially. If she was in trouble, I needed to find a way to help her, even if she didn't want my involvement. And if she was doing something that could destroy her future, I had to find a way to stop her before it was too late. The investigation I was about to begin would reveal truths that would force me to choose between protecting my daughter and doing what was right. It would lead to confrontations that would test every principle I believed in and ultimately result in the most devastating words I had ever heard. "You ruined my life." But Madison had no idea that she was about to face consequences that would make her understand the real meaning of those words. The decision to hire a private investigator felt like the ultimate betrayal of my own daughter, but I had exhausted every other option. Sleep had become a stranger to me as I lay awake night after night wrestling with scenarios that ranged from innocent explanations to criminal activity. The not knowing was destroying me from the inside out. I found Vincent Carrera through a referral from a lawyer friend who specialized in corporate fraud cases. Vincent had spent 20 years with the Chicago Police Department before starting his own investigation firm. He was discreet, thorough, and specialized in financial crimes. When I explained my situation during our initial meeting at a small diner on the outskirts of town, Vincent listened without judgment. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, stirring his coffee slowly, "I've seen plenty of parents in your situation. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is uncover the truth, even when that truth is painful. If your daughter is involved in something illegal, catching it early could save her from much worse consequences down the road." His words provided some comfort, but they didn't eliminate the guilt I felt about investigating my own child. Vincent explained that financial investigations typically took several weeks to complete thoroughly. He would need to track Madison's spending patterns, identify sources of income, and determine whether her lifestyle matched her legitimate earnings. The retainer fee was substantial, representing a significant portion of my savings. But after years of sacrificing for Madison's future, this felt like one more investment I had to make. If she was in trouble, I needed to know. If she was doing something that could destroy her future, I had to find a way to stop her before it was too late. Vincent began his work immediately. Within the first week, he had already identified several concerning patterns. Madison's credit card statements showed purchases that were completely inconsistent with her stated income. Designer clothing, expensive dinners at upscale restaurants, and luxury spa treatments painted a picture of someone living far beyond her means. More troubling were the cash deposits appearing regularly in her bank accounts.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Large sums of money were being deposited every few weeks, amounts that couldn't be explained by her salary from Hartwell and Associates. Vincent traced these deposits and discovered they were always made in cash at different branch locations throughout the city, a pattern designed to avoid drawing attention from banking authorities. "Your daughter is very careful about how she handles these transactions," Vincent explained during our second meeting. "She's rotating between different banks and keeping individual deposits below the threshold that would trigger automatic reporting requirements. This suggests someone has coached her on how to avoid detection." The implications were staggering. Madison wasn't just living beyond her means, she was actively working to conceal the source of her additional income. This level of sophistication suggested she was involved in something much more serious than I had imagined. Vincent's investigation expanded to include surveillance of Madison's daily activities. He documented her movements, photographed her interactions, and tracked her visits to locations that had no apparent connection to her legitimate work at the marketing firm. The picture that emerged was of someone leading a double life with meticulous precision. Madison would arrive at Hartwell & Associates each morning, maintaining the appearance of a dedicated employee. But Vincent discovered that she frequently left the office during lunch breaks and didn't return for hours. When questioned by colleagues about her whereabouts, she claimed to be attending client meetings or conducting research at external locations. The reality was far different. Vincent's surveillance revealed that Madison was spending these extended lunch breaks meeting with individuals who had no connection to her marketing work. These meetings typically took place in upscale hotels, expensive restaurants, or private clubs where business was conducted away from prying eyes. The people Madison was meeting with were particularly concerning. Vincent ran background checks on several individuals and discovered they had criminal records related to fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. These weren't the type of professional contacts a legitimate marketing coordinator should have been cultivating. One name kept appearing repeatedly in Vincent's reports: Angela Santos, a woman in her early 40s who appeared to be Madison's primary contact in whatever scheme she was involved in. Angela had been convicted of securities fraud 5 years earlier and had served 18 months in federal prison. Since her release, she had been investigated multiple times for suspected financial crimes but had managed to avoid additional convictions. Vincent obtained photographs of Madison and Angela together at various locations throughout the city. In every image, the two women appeared to be engaged in serious business discussions. Angela would often be seen handing Madison envelopes or small packages, transactions that were clearly not social in nature. "This Santos woman is bad news," Vincent explained as he spread the photographs across his desk. "She's been running sophisticated financial scams for years. The fact that your daughter is working closely with her suggests Madison is involved in something that could result in serious federal charges." The photographs hit me like a physical blow. Seeing my daughter consorting with known criminals, accepting what appeared to be payment for illegal activities, shattered any remaining hope that there might be an innocent explanation for her behavior. Madison had crossed a line that I never imagined she would approach, let alone cross. Vincent's investigation revealed the specific nature of Madison's criminal activity. She was part of a sophisticated invoice fraud scheme targeting small businesses throughout the Chicago area. The operation worked by creating fake invoices for services that were never provided, then using Madison's position at Hartwell & Associates to legitimize these fraudulent charges. Madison would identify potential targets through her legitimate work at the marketing firm. She had access to client information, including financial data and payment procedures, which she was providing to Angela's criminal network. The group would then create invoices that appeared to come from legitimate vendors, often for services related to marketing or advertising. Because the invoices appeared authentic and were for relatively small amounts, most businesses would pay them without extensive verification. Madison's inside information about how these companies processed payments made the scheme remarkably effective. Her legitimate position provided credibility that allowed the fraud to continue undetected for months. The scope of the operation was breathtaking. Vincent estimated that Madison and her associates had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from dozens of small businesses. Many of these were family-owned companies that could ill afford the losses they had suffered. The human cost of Madison's crimes extended far beyond the financial damage. What made Madison's involvement particularly egregious was her abuse of the position I had helped her obtain. The job at Hartwell & Associates, which had cost me $40,000 in reduced fees, was being used as a platform for criminal activity. Every contact she made, every piece of information she accessed, was being weaponized against innocent business owners.
Vincent provided detailed documentation of Madison's activities, including copies of fraudulent invoices, records of cash deposits, and photographs of her meetings with known criminals. The evidence was overwhelming and would be more than sufficient to support criminal charges against everyone involved in the scheme. As I reviewed the evidence, I felt a mixture of rage, disappointment, and heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm me completely. The daughter I had raised and sacrificed for had become someone I didn't recognize. Worse, she had used the opportunities I provided to hurt other people, destroying the financial security of families who were probably struggling just as I had struggled to build a better life. The decision of what to do with Vincent's findings was agonizing. I could confront Madison directly, hoping to convince her to stop her illegal activities and make restitution to her victims. But given how she had reacted to my previous attempts to discuss her behavior, I doubted she would be receptive to reason. I could also turn the evidence over to law enforcement and let the criminal justice system handle the situation. This would almost certainly result in Madison's arrest and prosecution, destroying any chance she had of building a legitimate career. But it would also ensure that the fraud scheme was stopped and that she faced appropriate consequences for her actions. The third option was to approach Richard Hartwell directly and let him handle the situation internally. This might allow Madison to avoid criminal charges if she agreed to make restitution and resign from her position. But it would also mean that other victims of the fraud scheme might never receive justice or compensation for their losses. Each option carried devastating consequences, not just for Madison, but for our already fractured relationship. Whatever choice I made would likely result in Madison viewing me as the enemy who destroyed her life. But allowing her to continue stealing from innocent families was not an option I could live with. After days of agonizing deliberation, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I contacted Richard Hartwell and requested an urgent private meeting. I explained that I had information about potential criminal activity involving one of his employees and that the matter required immediate attention to protect his company from legal liability. Richard agreed to meet me the following morning at his office before regular business hours. I spent the night before our meeting reviewing Vincent's evidence one final time, knowing that once I shared this information, there would be no turning back. My relationship with Madison would be permanently damaged, but I couldn't allow her crimes to continue. The meeting with Richard was one of the most difficult conversations I had ever had. I laid out the evidence systematically, starting with Madison's suspicious lifestyle and building toward the specific details of the fraud scheme. Richard's expression grew increasingly grave as he reviewed the photographs, financial records, and documentation of fraudulent invoices. "My God, Thomas," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I knew Madison had been struggling with some performance issues, but I never imagined anything like this."
She's been using our client information to target these businesses. This could destroy our reputation and expose us to massive liability. Richard explained that several of Hartwell & Associates' clients had mentioned receiving suspicious invoices for services they hadn't authorized. The accounting department had flagged these as potential scams, but they hadn't realized that someone within their own organization was providing information to the perpetrators. "We have to involve law enforcement immediately," Richard continued. "This isn't just theft, it's a sophisticated criminal enterprise that's been using our company as a front. Every day we delay increases our potential liability and allows these criminals to target additional victims." I knew Richard was right, but hearing him speak about involving law enforcement made the reality of the situation hit me with devastating force. Within hours, Madison would be under criminal investigation. Her career, her freedom, and any chance she had of building a legitimate future would be destroyed. Richard assured me that he would handle the situation discreetly and professionally. Madison would be terminated immediately, but she would be allowed to gather her personal belongings without being subjected to public humiliation. The evidence would be turned over to federal authorities who specialized in financial crimes, and the investigation would proceed according to proper legal procedures. "Thomas, I want you to know that I don't blame you for any of this," Richard said as our meeting concluded. "You tried to help your daughter, and she chose to abuse that opportunity. That's not your fault. You're doing the right thing by bringing this to my attention." His words provided little comfort as I drove home that morning. In a few hours, Madison's world would come crashing down, and she would have no idea that I was responsible for her downfall. The daughter, who had already accused me of interfering in her life, was about to discover just how completely I had exposed her secrets. I spent the rest of the morning in a state of anxious anticipation, knowing that somewhere across the city, Richard was meeting with his legal team and preparing to confront Madison with the evidence of her crimes. Part of me wanted to warn her, to give her a chance to prepare for what was coming, but I knew that any advance warning would only allow her to destroy evidence or flee before facing the consequences of her actions. The call came at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. Richard's voice was tense and formal as he informed me that Madison had been terminated and escorted from the building. She had denied all allegations initially, but when confronted with the photographic evidence and financial records, she had broken down and admitted to her involvement in the fraud scheme. "She's claiming that she was coerced into participating," Richard explained. "She says this Santos woman threatened her and forced her to provide information. But given the evidence we have about her lifestyle and the cash deposits, that explanation isn't credible. This was clearly a voluntary partnership that she entered into for financial gain." Richard also informed me that Madison had demanded to know how the company had obtained evidence of her activities. When told that the information had come from a private investigation, she had become enraged and accused the company of violating her privacy. She had stormed out of the building, threatening legal action and claiming that she was the victim of persecution. The disconnect between Madison's perception of herself and the reality of her situation was staggering. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of her crimes, she was portraying herself as the injured party. The sense of entitlement that had been growing for months had reached the point where she genuinely believed she was being treated unfairly. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself unable to concentrate on anything productive. I kept checking my phone, expecting a call or text from Madison, but hearing nothing. Part of me hoped she would reach out, giving us a chance to discuss what had happened and begin the process of addressing the damage she had caused. But as evening approached without any contact, I began to wonder if Madison was planning to simply disappear rather than face the consequences of her actions. Vincent had mentioned that flight was a common response when criminals realized they had been caught. The thought of losing Madison completely, of never having the chance to help her through this crisis, was almost unbearable. That fear proved to be unfounded. At exactly 7:15, I heard Madison's car pull into the driveway with an aggressive screech of tires. The engine shut off with unusual force, and I could hear her stomping up the front steps. When she burst through the door, her face was contorted with a rage I had never seen before. Madison didn't bother with pleasantries or explanations. She stood in the entryway, her entire body trembling with fury, and looked at me with an expression of pure hatred. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was filled with a venom that cut through me like a blade. "You destroyed me," she said, her words delivered with deliberate precision. "You hired someone to spy on me, you ruined my career, and you turned everyone against me. You couldn't stand to see me succeed without your help, so you sabotaged everything I worked for." The accusations were so far removed from reality that I initially thought she was having some kind of breakdown. But as she continued her tirade, it became clear that Madison genuinely believed she was the victim in this situation. In her mind, I was the villain who had destroyed her life out of jealousy or spite. "Madison, you were stealing from innocent families," I said. "You were using the job I helped you get to commit crimes. I couldn't let that continue." My attempt to explain the situation only intensified her rage. Madison began pacing around the living room like a caged animal, gesticulating wildly as she recounted all the ways I had supposedly wronged her. According to her version of events, I had been controlling and manipulative from the beginning, forcing her into a job she didn't want, and then sabotaging her when she tried to build an independent life. "You never wanted me to succeed on my own," she screamed, her voice breaking with emotion. "You wanted me to stay dependent on you forever, so you could control every aspect of my life. When I finally found a way to make real money and build something for myself, you couldn't handle it.
The cognitive dissonance was stunning. Madison was describing her criminal activities as legitimate business success and portraying my efforts to stop her theft as jealous interference. She had constructed an alternative reality in which she was an entrepreneur who had been persecuted for her success rather than a criminal who had been caught stealing. I tried repeatedly to redirect the conversation toward the victims of her crimes, the small business owners who had lost money because of her fraudulent invoices. But Madison dismissed these concerns entirely, claiming that the businesses could afford the losses and that she deserved compensation for the valuable information she had provided. "Those companies have insurance," she said dismissively, "and I was providing a service by helping them identify weaknesses in their payment systems. If anything, I was doing them a favor by showing them how easy it was to get cheated." The rationalization was breathtaking in its audacity. Madison had convinced herself that stealing from small businesses was actually a public service that deserved financial reward. The moral framework that should have prevented her from harming innocent people had been completely abandoned in favor of self-serving justifications. As her tirade continued, Madison's accusations became increasingly personal and hurtful.
She blamed me for her mother's departure, claiming that Caroline had left because she couldn't stand watching me ruin Madison's development. She accused me of sabotaging her relationships and career opportunities out of a desire to keep her isolated and dependent. "You're a pathetic old man who can't stand the thought of being alone," she said, her words designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. "You destroyed my mother's happiness, and now you're trying to destroy mine. But I won't let you control me anymore." The pain of hearing these accusations from my own daughter was almost unbearable. Every sacrifice I had made, every effort to support her dreams and ambitions was being reframed as manipulation and control. The love and dedication that had defined my relationship with Madison were being weaponized against me. But what hurt most was the realization that Madison genuinely believed what she was saying. This wasn't just anger speaking, it was a fundamental rewriting of our entire relationship. She had convinced herself that I was the source of all her problems, absolving herself of responsibility for the choices that had led to her current situation. The argument escalated when I produced copies of the evidence Vincent had gathered, hoping that seeing the documentation of her crimes might break through her denial. But instead of acknowledging the seriousness of her situation, Madison focused entirely on the violation of privacy she claimed to have suffered. "You had me followed like a criminal," she said, her voice rising to a shout. "You invaded my privacy, violated my trust, and destroyed my reputation. You're the one who should be ashamed, not me." I tried to explain that I had hired the investigator out of concern for her welfare, not to harm her. When I noticed the signs that she might be in trouble, I had wanted to help her before the situation became worse. But Madison interpreted every expression of concern as evidence of my supposed controlling nature. The conversation reached its climax when Madison demanded that I admit I had acted out of jealousy and spite. She wanted me to acknowledge that I couldn't handle her success and had deliberately set out to destroy her life. When I refused to validate this false narrative, her rage reached a fever pitch. Madison stepped closer to me, her face flushed with anger and her eyes blazing with fury. She raised her voice to a scream that seemed to shake the walls of the house where we had shared so many happy memories. The words that came out of her mouth would echo in my mind forever, defining the moment when our relationship was irreparably damaged. "You ruined my life," she screamed, her voice breaking with the intensity of her emotion. "You took away everything I worked for and destroyed my future. I will never forgive you for this. Never!" The finality in her voice was devastating. This wasn't the angry outburst of someone who would eventually cool down and see reason. This was a complete rejection of our relationship and everything we had shared. Madison was cutting me out of her life with the same deliberate precision she had used to plan her criminal activities. She turned toward the door, But before leaving, she delivered one final blow that would haunt me for months to come. Looking back at me with an expression of pure contempt, she spoke words that redefined our entire relationship in terms of hatred and betrayal. "I wish Caroline had taken me with her when she left," Madison said, her voice cold and calculating. "At least then I would have been raised by someone who actually cared about my happiness instead of someone who wanted to control and destroy me." With those words, she walked out of my life, slamming the door with such force that pictures fell from the walls. I stood alone in the sudden silence, surrounded by the remnants of a relationship that had once been the most important thing in my world. The daughter I had loved and sacrificed for was gone, replaced by someone who viewed me as the enemy who had ruined her life. In the days that followed Madison's explosive departure, the full consequences of her criminal activities began to unfold. Federal investigators contacted me as part of their expanding probe into the invoice fraud scheme. They confirmed that Madison had been a central figure in an operation that had stolen nearly $500,000 from small businesses across the Midwest. The investigation revealed that Madison's involvement had been far more extensive than even Vincent's research had uncovered. She had been providing inside information to Angela Santos's criminal network for over 8 months, helping them target not just current clients of Hartwell & Associates, but also former clients and companies that had simply inquired about services. Madison's access to the company's customer relationship management system had allowed the criminals to create highly targeted fraudulent invoices that were extremely difficult to detect. They knew exactly how much money to request, which payment methods to specify, and even which employees were most likely to approve payments without extensive verification. The sophistication of the scheme was matched by its callousness. Many of the targeted businesses were family-owned operations that were already struggling financially. The fraudulent charges often represented a significant percentage of their monthly revenue, forcing some to delay employee payments or postpone essential business investments. One particularly heartbreaking case involved a small restaurant that had been charged $3,000 for a marketing campaign that was never delivered. The owners had struggled to make the payment, eventually borrowing money from relatives to avoid defaulting on what they believed was a legitimate business expense. When they discovered they had been defrauded, the financial and emotional damage was devastating. Federal prosecutors were pursuing charges against Madison that could result in up to 10 years in prison. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her decision to live openly on the proceeds of her crimes had made it impossible to claim ignorance or coercion. Every luxury purchase, every cash deposit, and every meeting with known criminals had been documented in meticulous detail. Angela Santos and 2 other members of the criminal network were also facing federal charges, but prosecutors were particularly interested in Madison's case because her abuse of a legitimate employment position had allowed the scheme to operate with unprecedented effectiveness. Her betrayal of professional trust had elevated what might have been a relatively minor fraud into a major federal case. The media attention surrounding the arrests was intense and humiliating. Local news outlets ran stories about the marketing coordinator turned fraudster who had used her position to steal from small businesses. Madison's photograph appeared on television and in newspapers, forever linking her name with criminal activity. I watched these news reports with a mixture of sadness and validation. Part of me felt vindicated that the truth about Madison's activities was finally being exposed. But seeing my daughter portrayed as a criminal mastermind was heartbreaking, regardless of how accurate that portrayal might be. The impact on my own life was significant as well. Colleagues and neighbors who learned about Madison's crimes often looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. Some wondered if I had been aware of her activities all along. Others questioned whether my parenting had somehow contributed to her willingness to harm innocent people. The guilt was overwhelming at times. I replayed years of interactions with Madison, searching for signs that might have predicted her descent into criminal behavior. Had I been too permissive? Too controlling? Had my efforts to give her advantages actually prevented her from developing the moral character necessary to resist temptation? Sleep became elusive as I wrestled with questions that had no clear answers.
The house that had once been filled with laughter and conversation became a tomb of regret and second-guessing. Every room held memories of the daughter I thought I knew, making it impossible to escape the reality of how wrong I had been about the person she had become. 3 weeks after Madison's arrest, I received a call that I had been dreading. Her court-appointed attorney wanted to discuss the possibility of my testifying on her behalf during the sentencing phase of her trial. The lawyer explained that character witnesses could potentially help reduce the length of Madison's prison sentence. The request put me in an impossible position. On one hand, Madison was still my daughter, and I wanted to do everything possible to minimize the consequences she would face. On the other hand, testifying on her behalf would require me to ignore the harm she had caused to innocent families and the complete lack of remorse she had shown for her actions. I agreed to meet with the attorney, hoping to find some middle ground that would allow me to help Madison without compromising my own principles. But the conversation only reinforced how far apart we had grown and how irreconcilable our perspectives had become. The attorney, a young woman named Patricia Chen, explained that Madison's best hope for a reduced sentence was to demonstrate that she had been led astray by more experienced criminals who had exploited her inexperience and vulnerability. This narrative would require portraying Madison as a victim who had been manipulated into participating in crimes she didn't fully understand. Your daughter maintains that she was coerced into providing information to Angela Santos, Patricia explained. She claims that Santos threatened to harm her if she didn't cooperate. If you could testify about Madison's character and her susceptibility to intimidation, it might help convince the judge that she deserves leniency. The request was based on a fundamental lie. Vincent's investigation had clearly documented that Madison had entered into her criminal partnership voluntarily and had actively sought ways to maximize her illegal income. She had not been coerced or manipulated. She had been a willing and enthusiastic participant in a scheme designed to steal from vulnerable businesses. I explained to Patricia that I couldn't testify in support of a narrative that I knew to be false. While I loved Madison and wanted to help her, I couldn't ignore the evidence of her guilt and the harm she had caused to innocent families. Any testimony I provided would have to be truthful about both her positive qualities and her responsibility for her actions. Patricia seemed disappointed but not surprised by my response. She explained that family members often struggled with the conflicting loyalties involved in criminal cases, but she also made it clear that any testimony that didn't support Madison's claims of coercion would likely do more harm than good for her case. The conversation ended with Patricia informing me that Madison had specifically requested that I not be contacted again about the case. She wanted nothing to do with me and blamed me entirely for the legal predicament she was facing. In her mind, I remained the villain who had destroyed her life rather than the father who had tried to stop her from destroying the lives of others. This final rejection completed the transformation of our relationship from love and trust to hatred and blame. Madison had not only cut me out of her life, she had assigned me the role of primary antagonist in the story she told herself about her situation. I was no longer her father, I was the enemy who had caused all her problems. The trial proceeded without my involvement, and Madison ultimately pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution to her victims, an amount that exceeded $200,000. Local media covered the sentencing hearing, reporting that Madison had shown little remorse for her actions and had continued to blame others for her situation. According to court reporters, she had used her final statement to claim that she was the victim of persecution and that the real criminals had escaped punishment. Reading these accounts confirmed what I had already come to understand. Madison had not learned from her experience or developed any genuine understanding of the harm she had caused to her victims. Even facing years in prison, she remained focused on her own grievances rather than the suffering of her victims. The day Madison was taken into custody marked the end of one chapter of our relationship and the beginning of another. For over 20 years, being her father had been the defining aspect of my identity. Every major decision I made was filtered through the question of how it would affect Madison's well-being and future opportunities. Now, for the first time since her birth, I had to figure out who I was when I wasn't actively parenting Madison. The freedom was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Without the constant worry about her welfare and success, I was forced to confront the reality of how much of my own life I had neglected in favor of focusing on hers. The house that had been our shared home for so many years felt like a museum of failed dreams and broken promises. Every room contained reminders of the daughter I thought I was raising and the future I thought we were building together. The silence that had once been filled with conversation and laughter became a constant reminder of how completely our relationship had collapsed. But as painful as the separation was, I also began to experience something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The constant anxiety about Madison's behavior, her financial situation, and her future was gone. I no longer had to wonder what she was hiding or worry about what she might do next. The truth, as devastating as it was, had provided a kind of clarity that allowed me to begin processing the grief of losing the daughter I thought I knew. The investigation and trial had also provided validation that my concerns about Madison's behavior had been justified. The defensive anger she had shown whenever I tried to discuss her situation hadn't been the result of my interference. It had been the reaction of someone who was hiding criminal activity. My parental instincts, which she had dismissed as controlling and paranoid, had been accurate assessments of a genuinely dangerous situation. This realization helped alleviate some of the guilt I felt for having Madison investigated and ultimately exposed. While the consequences for her had been severe, the alternative would have been to allow her criminal activities to continue indefinitely. The longer the fraud scheme had operated, the more victims would have suffered, and the more serious the eventual charges against Madison would have become. Madison's sentence of 3 years in federal prison was significant, but it was far less than what she would have faced if the fraud scheme had continued for several more years. Her restitution she owed to her victims was substantial, but it was manageable compared to the millions of dollars she could have stolen with continued access to inside information. In a perverse way, my decision to expose Madison's crimes had actually protected her from the worst possible outcomes of her choices.
But she would never see it that way, and our relationship would never recover from the role I had played in ending her criminal career. The final chapter of our story was still being written as Madison began serving her prison sentence. I had no contact with her and no information about how she was adapting to incarceration. For all I knew, she was still blaming me for her situation and refusing to accept responsibility for the choices that had led to her imprisonment. But I had to live with the knowledge that I had done the right thing, even though it had cost me the most important relationship in my life. The daughter who screamed that I had ruined her life would never understand that I had actually saved her from ruining it completely herself. 2 years and 4 months after Madison disappeared behind the walls of Federal Correctional Institution Greenville, I received an envelope with no return address. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, though it appeared more careful and deliberate than the hurried scrawl I remembered from her teenage years. My hands trembled as I opened what would be the first communication from my daughter since that devastating night when she screamed that I had ruined her life. The letter was 3 pages long, written on standard prison stationery in blue ink.
As I read her words, I found myself transported back to the complex emotions that had defined our fractured relationship. But something in her tone was different from the venomous accusations she had hurled at me during our final confrontation. Madison began by acknowledging that she knew I probably never expected to hear from her again. She wrote about the anger she had carried for the first 18 months of her incarceration, anger that had consumed her thoughts and poisoned her interactions with other inmates and counselors. She described lying awake at night, crafting elaborate revenge fantasies and imagining all the ways she would make me pay for destroying her future. But then, something had shifted during her mandatory participation in a financial crimes rehabilitation program. The course required inmates to research and write detailed reports about the victims of their crimes, examining not just the financial impact, but the broader consequences for individuals and families who had been targeted. Madison wrote about spending weeks in the prison library reading newspaper articles about small business closures and family financial crises that had occurred in the aftermath of fraudulent schemes similar to the one she had participated in. She had been forced to confront the reality that her actions had caused genuine suffering to people who had worked hard to build legitimate businesses. The letter described a particular moment of clarity that had occurred while she was researching the restaurant that had been charged $3,000 for marketing services that were never provided. Madison had discovered that the business had ultimately closed 6 months after being defrauded, citing financial difficulties that included their inability to recover from unexpected losses. "I realized that a family lost their livelihood because of what I did," she wrote. "Children had to change schools because their parents couldn't afford to keep living in the same neighborhood. A dream that probably took years to build was destroyed, in part because I thought I deserved money that wasn't mine." The acknowledgement of responsibility was something I had never heard from Madison before. Throughout the investigation, trial, and sentencing, she had consistently portrayed herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Reading her recognition that real people had suffered because of her choices brought tears to my eyes. Madison continued by describing the anger management counseling she had been attending, where she had been forced to examine the origins of her rage and resentment. She wrote about gradually recognizing that the sense of entitlement that had led to her criminal activities had also poisoned her relationships with people who genuinely cared about her welfare. "I blamed you for everything that went wrong in my life because it was easier than accepting that I had made terrible choices," she wrote. "I convinced myself that you were controlling and manipulative because I couldn't face the truth that you were trying to protect me from myself." The letter included a detailed apology for the cruel things she had said during our final argument. Madison acknowledged that her claim about wishing Caroline had taken her away had been designed specifically to cause maximum emotional damage. She recognized that I had sacrificed constantly throughout her childhood and young adulthood, and that her accusations of selfishness and control had been unfair and hurtful. But what struck me most powerfully was her admission that she had known her lifestyle was unsustainable long before I hired the private investigator. Madison wrote about the constant anxiety she had experienced while participating in the fraud scheme, knowing that discovery was inevitable, but feeling unable to stop because she had become addicted to the easy money and luxury lifestyle. "I was terrified every day that someone would figure out what I was doing," she wrote. "But I couldn't bring myself to walk away from Angela and her network because I didn't want to go back to struggling financially. I thought I deserved to live better than my legitimate income would allow." Madison described the relief she had actually felt when her criminal activities were finally exposed. The constant stress of maintaining lies and avoiding detection had been exhausting. Even though she had reacted with rage and denial at the time, part of her had been grateful that the deception was finally over. The letter also included information about her plans for rebuilding her life after her release. Madison had been participating in vocational training programs and had earned certifications in accounting and bookkeeping. She was working with a prison counselor to develop a realistic budget for living on legitimate income and had been attending weekly meetings with a support group for inmates who had committed criminal financial crimes. "I know I can never undo the harm I caused to those business owners, but I'm committed to making the restitution payments and proving that I can build a legitimate life without stealing from other people. I want to become someone you can be proud of again, even if our relationship can never go back to what it was before." The letter concluded with a request that surprised me. Madison asked if I would be willing to participate in a restorative justice program that the prison offered to inmates who were preparing for release. The program involved facilitated conversations between offenders and people who had been affected by their crimes, designed to promote understanding and healing for all parties involved. Madison explained that while the business owners she had defrauded were the primary victims of her crimes, she had come to understand that I had also been victimized by her actions. My trust had been betrayed, my financial sacrifice had been exploited, and my efforts to help her had been turned against innocent families. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness," she wrote, "but I would like the chance to apologize properly and to show you that I understand how my actions affected you. If you're willing to meet with me, I promise I won't blame you for anything or try to make excuses for what I did." The letter was signed simply Madison without any of the affectionate closings that had characterized our correspondence throughout her childhood and young adulthood. But the formal tone somehow made her words seem more sincere and thoughtful than emotional appeals might have been. I read the letter multiple times over the following days, trying to process the complex emotions it triggered. The apology felt genuine, and Madison's acknowledgement of responsibility represented a fundamental shift from the defensive denial she had maintained throughout her legal proceedings. But I also knew that people in desperate situations often say what they believe others want to hear. The decision of whether to participate in the restorative justice program required me to examine my own feelings about forgiveness and reconciliation. Part of me wanted to believe that Madison had genuinely changed and that we might be able to rebuild some kind of relationship based on honesty and mutual respect. But another part of me remained skeptical about her motivations. Was this newfound remorse a genuine transformation, or was it a calculated attempt to gain sympathy and support as her release date approached? Had she truly accepted responsibility for her actions, or had she simply learned to express the right words to manipulate people's emotions? I decided to seek advice from Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist who specialized in family relationships affected by criminal behavior. Dr. Chen had been recommended by a support group for families of incarcerated individuals that I had briefly attended during the first year of Madison's imprisonment. During our session, Dr. Chen helped me understand that my skepticism was a natural response to the betrayal I had experienced. Trust once broken through criminal behavior required substantial evidence of genuine change before it could be safely rebuilt. Madison's letter was a positive sign, but it was only the beginning of a process that would take years to complete. The question isn't whether Madison has been completely transformed by her incarceration.
The question is whether participating in this program would be beneficial for your own healing process, regardless of what it means for your relationship with her. Dr. Chen suggested that I approach the restorative justice meeting as an opportunity to express my own feelings about Madison's betrayal, rather than as a step toward reconciliation. If Madison was genuinely committed to making amends, she needed to understand the full impact of her actions on everyone who had trusted and supported her. After weeks of consideration, I agreed to participate in the program. I wrote back to Madison explaining that I was willing to meet with her, but that my participation shouldn't be interpreted as forgiveness or as a commitment to rebuilding our relationship. I needed to hear what she had to say, but I also needed her to understand how profoundly her actions had affected my life. The restorative justice meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning in the prison's family visitation center. I arrived early, feeling a mixture of nervousness and curiosity about seeing Madison after more than 2 years of complete separation. The woman who walked into the meeting room bore little resemblance to the angry, defensive person who had stormed out of my house. Madison's appearance had changed dramatically during her incarceration. She was thinner and looked older than her 26 years. Her hair was shorter and styled simply, and she wore no makeup or jewelry. But what struck me most was the change in her demeanor. The arrogant confidence that had characterized her behavior during her criminal period was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. The meeting was facilitated by a trained counselor who helped structure our conversation to ensure that both parties had opportunities to express their perspectives. Madison began by reading a prepared statement that expanded on the themes from her letter, acknowledging her responsibility for the crimes and their impact on victims. But when she turned to address me directly, her composure began to crack. Speaking through tears, Madison described the shame she felt about exploiting the opportunities I had provided and using my efforts to help her as a platform for hurting other families. "You sacrificed $40,000 to get me that job," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You worked extra hours and gave up your own comfort to give me a chance at success. And I turned that gift into a weapon for stealing from people who were probably struggling just like you struggled to build a better life for me." Madison talked about the isolation she had felt in prison, cut off from everyone who had ever cared about her because of her own choices. She described the letters from her mother that had gone unanswered because she couldn't face the disappointment in Caroline's words. She spoke about declining visits from former college friends because she was too ashamed to explain how she had ended up incarcerated. "I destroyed every relationship that mattered to me because I was too proud to admit I had made mistakes," she continued. "But losing your respect and your love was the worst consequence of all. You were the one person who never gave up on me, and I threw that away for money that I didn't even need." The counselor then invited me to share my own perspective on how Madison's actions had affected my life. I talked about the sleepless nights I had spent worrying about her welfare, not knowing that she was actually thriving through criminal activity. I described the guilt I felt about possibly contributing to her sense of entitlement by removing too many obstacles from her path. I also expressed my anger about the way she had weaponized our relationship during our final argument, using my love for her as a tool to inflict emotional damage. The accusation that I was a controlling, selfish father had been designed to hurt me as deeply as possible, and it had succeeded. "You knew exactly what to say to destroy me," I told her, feeling the anger of that night flooding back. "You turned every sacrifice I made into evidence of my selfishness. You made me question whether I had been a good father or whether I had actually damaged you by trying too hard to help." Madison listened without defending herself or making excuses. When I finished speaking, she simply nodded and said, "You're right. I knew those words would hurt you, and I said them because I wanted you to feel as destroyed as I felt. But you didn't deserve that pain, and I'm sorry for trying to make you suffer for my own mistakes." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. Madison answered my questions about her criminal activities honestly, providing details that helped me understand how the fraud scheme had operated and how she had rationalized her participation. She also talked about the factors that had made her vulnerable to Angela Santos's recruitment. The pressure to maintain an expensive lifestyle, the ease of the initial requests for information, and the gradual escalation from minor ethical violations to serious criminal activity had created a pattern that became increasingly difficult to break. "I told myself that I was just providing information," Madison explained. "I convinced myself that I wasn't really hurting anyone because the amounts were small and the businesses could afford the losses. But every time I helped them target another victim, I became more invested in the scheme and less able to walk away." By the end of the meeting, I had a much clearer understanding of how Madison had descended into criminal behavior and why she had reacted so defensively when confronted with evidence of her activities. The anger and denial hadn't been calculated manipulation. They had been the desperate responses of someone who couldn't face the reality of what she had become. But understanding Madison's perspective didn't automatically translate into forgiveness or reconciliation. The meeting had provided closure and clarity, but it had also reinforced how completely our relationship had been damaged by her choices and their consequences. Madison seemed to understand this as we prepared to leave. She thanked me for participating in the program, but didn't ask for promises about future contact or support. Instead, she simply said that she hoped someday I might be able to think of her without anger or disappointment. "I know I can't be your daughter in the same way I was before," she said as we stood to leave. "But I hope that someday you'll be able to see that the person who did those terrible things wasn't the real me. I lost myself for a while, but I'm working to find my way back to being someone you raised me to be." 6 months later, Madison was released from federal prison to a halfway house in Milwaukee. She sent me a brief note informing me of her release and providing contact information in case I ever wanted to reach out. The note was factual and respectful, asking nothing and promising nothing beyond her commitment to rebuilding her life legitimately. I didn't respond immediately, but I did begin following news about her progress through mutual acquaintances.
Madison found work as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit organization that specifically hired former inmates. She was living in a modest apartment and making regular restitution payments to the victims of her crimes. More importantly, she seemed to be maintaining the humble, responsible persona that had emerged during her incarceration. The reports I received suggested that she was working hard, living within her means, and avoiding the luxury lifestyle that had contributed to her criminal activities. A year after her release, I received an unexpected phone call from Caroline, Madison's mother. Caroline had maintained contact with Madison throughout her incarceration and wanted to update me on her progress. She also wanted to discuss the possibility of our family beginning a careful process of reconciliation. "Madison has changed, Thomas," Caroline said during our conversation. "I was skeptical at first, just like you probably are, but she's been consistent for almost 2 years now. She's working hard, living responsibly, and seems genuinely committed to making amends for what she did." Caroline explained that Madison had been attending therapy regularly and participating in a support group for people who had committed financial crimes. She was also volunteering with a program that helps other former inmates transition back into society, using her own experience to guide people who are struggling with similar challenges. "She asks about you sometimes," Caroline continued, "not in a way that's trying to manipulate me into advocating for her, but just wondering how you're doing."
I think she genuinely cares about your welfare and regrets the pain she caused you. The conversation with Caroline forced me to confront the question of whether I was ready to consider rebuilding some kind of relationship with Madison. 3 years had passed since our devastating final argument, and the acute pain of her betrayal had gradually been replaced by a more manageable sadness about the loss of our close relationship. During those 3 years, I had rebuilt my own life around interests and relationships that had nothing to do with Madison's drama and crises. I had traveled extensively, developed new friendships, and even entered into a serious romantic relationship with a woman named Linda who understood my complicated family situation. The independence I had gained from Madison's absence had been liberating in many ways. I no longer worried constantly about her welfare or spent my emotional energy trying to solve her problems. The peace and stability I had found were precious, and I was reluctant to risk them by reopening a relationship that had caused me so much pain. But I also recognized that my complete estrangement from Madison carried its own costs. She was still my daughter, and the love I had felt for her hadn't disappeared entirely despite everything that had happened. If she had genuinely changed and was committed to living responsibly, perhaps we could find a way to build a new relationship based on honesty and mutual respect. After months of consideration, I decided to send Madison a brief email suggesting that we might try meeting for coffee in a neutral location. I made it clear that this wouldn't represent a return to our previous relationship, but rather an opportunity to see whether we could build something new based on who we had both become. Madison's response was immediate and grateful. She suggested meeting at a small cafe in downtown Chicago that was convenient for both of us but had no emotional significance for either of us. She also made it clear that she had no expectations beyond the chance to see me and demonstrate that she was living the responsible life she had promised during our prison meeting. The reunion took place on a warm Saturday morning in May, almost 4 years after Madison had walked out of my house in rage. I arrived early and watched through the cafe window as she approached the building. She looked healthy and well-groomed, dressed in simple professional attire that was appropriate for her income level. When Madison entered the cafe, I was struck once again by how different she appeared from the angry, defensive person who had blamed me for destroying her life. She moved with quiet confidence rather than arrogant entitlement, and her expression was open and genuine rather than calculating. Our conversation began cautiously, with updates about work, living situations, and general well-being. Madison talked about her job at the nonprofit organization and the satisfaction she found in helping other people rebuild their lives after incarceration. She seemed genuinely proud of the progress she had made without expressing any expectation that I should share her enthusiasm. As we became more comfortable with each other, our conversation gradually moved toward more personal topics. Madison talked about the therapy she was continuing and the insights she had gained about the factors that had contributed to her criminal behavior.
She also expressed curiosity about my own life and the changes I had made during our years of separation. When I mentioned Linda and the serious relationship I had developed, Madison's response surprised me with its maturity and genuine happiness for my well-being. Rather than expressing jealousy or resentment about being replaced in my affections, she seemed pleased that I had found companionship and support. "I'm glad you found someone who makes you happy," she said sincerely. "I know my problems consumed so much of your energy for so many years. You deserve to have a relationship that brings you joy instead of constant worry." The conversation lasted for nearly 3 hours, far longer than either of us had expected. By the time we prepared to leave, I felt cautiously optimistic that Madison had indeed undergone a genuine transformation. Her humility seemed authentic, her acceptance of responsibility appeared complete, and her commitment to living responsibly was evidenced by her actions rather than just her words. We agreed to meet again in a few weeks, establishing a pattern of occasional contact that would allow us to rebuild trust gradually. I made it clear that I needed to see consistent evidence of positive change before I could consider fully trusting her again, and Madison accepted this condition without complaint. Over the following months, our relationship slowly evolved from cautious contact to something resembling genuine friendship. Madison never asked for financial help or emotional support beyond the basic human connection of our meetings. She seemed content to demonstrate her commitment to responsible living through her actions rather than her words. A year after our first reunion meeting, Madison achieved a milestone that filled me with pride despite all the pain of our past. She made her final restitution payment to the victims of her crimes, completing the financial obligations that had resulted from her criminal activities. She had worked extra hours, lived frugally, and prioritized these payments above every other expense for 3 years. Madison called to share this news, and I could hear the relief and satisfaction in her voice. She had carried the burden of debt to her victims since her sentencing, and completing these payments represented more than just a legal obligation. It was proof that she could follow through on commitments and make sacrifices to correct her past mistakes. The completion of her restitution payments marked a turning point in my own feelings about Madison's transformation. For over 3 years, she had consistently demonstrated the values and behaviors that I had tried to instill in her during her childhood. She had worked hard, lived responsibly, and prioritized obligations to others above her own comfort. This didn't erase the pain of her betrayal or automatically restore the close relationship we had once shared, but it did provide evidence that the daughter I had raised was still there beneath the criminal behavior that had temporarily consumed her judgment and values. As I reflected on our journey from that devastating night when she screamed that I had ruined her life to this moment of quiet reconciliation, I realized that we had both been changed by the experience in fundamental ways. Madison had learned that actions have consequences and that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt through consistent demonstration rather than mere words. I had learned that love sometimes requires making painful choices that feel like betrayal in the moment, but ultimately serve the best interests of everyone involved. Exposing Madison's criminal activities had destroyed our relationship temporarily, but it had also forced her to confront the reality of her behavior and begin the process of genuine change. The relationship we were building now was different from the one we had lost. It was based on mutual respect rather than parental authority, on demonstrated trustworthiness rather than assumed loyalty, and on acceptance of each other as imperfect adults rather than idealized roles. This new relationship was more fragile than what we had shared before, but it was also more honest. Madison could no longer take my support for granted, and I could no longer assume that loving her meant protecting her from the consequences of her choices. The journey from her bitter accusation that I had ruined her life to her grateful acknowledgement that I had ultimately saved her from worse consequences had taken 4 years to complete. But the destination we had reached was worth the painful path we had traveled to get there. Madison was not the daughter I had once imagined she would become, but she was a woman I could respect and be proud of. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it was even better than what we had lost, because it was built on truth rather than illusion, on earned trust rather than blind faith. Looking back on that terrible night when everything fell apart, I could finally see that Madison's accusation had been both completely wrong and strangely prophetic.
I hadn't ruined her life by exposing her crimes. I had ruined the false life she had built on stolen money and broken trust. But in destroying that illusion, I had given her the chance to build something real in its place. The woman sitting across from me in that cafe, discussing her work and her hopes for the future with quiet pride and genuine humility, was living proof that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to enable their child's self-destruction. Sometimes ruining the life someone thinks they want is the only way to save the life they actually need. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.